Ugolino, Dante's last sympathetic sinner.
It seems ungrateful to do so, because the Romantics, in fact, rediscovered Dante. But the burden of the remarks that are going to follow is that the Romantics were very bad readers of Dante's text, at least if we're interested in the moral basis of that text. It's also difficult for us, near the end of the 20th century, who've grown up even in America, a long way across the sea from Italy, hearing the name Dante. There are many athletes whose first name is Dante. He's grown up in our culture in a way that he would have been very surprised, I think, to find. Everyone knows there's a place called Dante's Inferno. It's very often a bar when it gets translated into an actual place in our civilization. Everyone's heard of Dante. It's really quite amazing. Not all that many people have read him. But we would, I think, if we polled, let's say, Americans in 1996, we would find an astoundingly high name recognition for Dante. If we had polled the world in, say, 1750, we would have gotten outside of Italy, and even in Italy, we would not have found that much compared to today, for instance. We would have found that basically no one either had heard of Dante, or if they'd heard of him, wanted to talk about him very much. Those people who spend time arguing about the canon of great works should take into account the fact that whether you like canons or dislike them, that the thing we can say most true about them is that they're shifting. And if your time frame is long enough, you will find that they change even quite radically from moment to moment in human history. I say this because I think it's important to realize that without the Romantic rediscovery of Dante, starting in the end of the 18th century and having its full fruit in the early 19th century, Dante would not have been in great books courses. This writer whom I think I would with great certainty be able to say he is at least one of the 5 greatest writers who's ever lived, and find hardly anyone who would want to debate that point. It's quite remarkable, I believe, that I am able to make such gestures precisely because the Romantics rediscovered Dante. And they did so by reading him in a way I, the ingrate, I'm employed by their rediscovery of Dante, would like to suggest the way in which they read him is not a good way of reading Dante, at least if we care about the poem that Dante left us rather than the way in which we want to take it and make it do what we would like it to. As one might imagine, the Romantic reading of Dante centers on the great figures in Inferno. In fact, most Romantic prose about this text is centered in the Inferno. The Romantics find that Dante is magnificent in expressing great feeling, and you may have heard that I, in my own mind, was capitalizing that G and that F. That is what Dante is the marvelous poet of. He knows how to explore the depth of human emotion. I'm not going to tell you I think that's untrue. I think it's very true. It's one of the reasons that everyone who has liked Dante has liked him over the years, indeed over the centuries. But what they do, the Romantics in their reading of him, is locate those particularly terrifying or beautiful moments in the Inferno of particularly affecting characters. And one might guess what that list would include. Certainly Francesca, who gets written about them a great deal, by them a great deal. Farinata in the 10th canto. Pier de Lavinia in the 13th. Ulysses, notably, in Canto 26. And the subject of today's talk, Ugolino, in the 33rd canto of the Inferno. And probably the first and last of that list the most, Francesca and Ugolino. Let me try to look at the problem we're going to approach now from what I conceive to be, it's hubris to say from Dante's point of view, from what I conceive to be Dante's point of view. What was the challenge? Challenge was how to present sinful characters in such a way that when they seem most positively affecting to us, that we're nonetheless able to read through and behind their very rhetoric to see what's wrong with it. To understand, in other words, that they convict themselves out of their own mouths. Now, this is a chancy business. It's a strategy that relies on a particular kind of readerly intelligence and readerly involvement in the text of the poem. It means we have to be reading very closely, and paying very close attention to Dante, to feel his moves, as it were. So it's a high-risk strategy on the part of an author, and it's one that doesn't always pay off. I would argue that essentially Dante was wrong in hoping that we would be able to track this strategy, and at least in the modern reading of the Commedia, we get very confused and tend to accept the self-evaluations of various of the sinners in the Inferno as being the way that we ought to read them, the way that we should respond to them. That's what they'd like, and it is not, I would argue, what the author of the poem would like. Further, the situation is complicated because the author of the poem is also a character in the poem. He is interacting with them, and when we first begin watching him interact, we realize that he's got some major problems of his own. That is, he is markedly prone to sinfulness. We see in the Francesca canto, the fifth canto of the Inferno, at the end of that interview, Dante faints with some sense of identity with Paolo and with Francesca. And we understand that that's probably not what he ought to be doing, that he should be resisting the temptation that she represents to him. That's just one example of the kind of problem that we have. Whom do we identify with? Do we identify with the sinner? Do we identify with the poet himself, apparently identifying with the sinner? Or do we claim to hear the sterner voice of the poet who is criticizing, at least implicitly, that younger self who fainted out of affection and identity with Francesca? Let me give you what I take to be a classically lovely instance of how Dante makes it possible for you to read away from identifying with the sinner. Now, I'm not sure this is true. I think it's very pretty. I'd like to believe it is true, but I will try it for you. At the very end of Francesca's very famous speech, perhaps the best-known 18 lines of literature in the West, is known by heart by millions of Italian school children who grow up into full-fledged Italian men and women who can at any moment recite these 18 lines. All you have to do is mention the first one and off they go. I've had that happen. The very last line of her speech, the 138th verse of the fifth canto, is just quel giorno non vi leggemo avanti, and that day we read in it no further. She's referring to the Lancelot romance, which she and Paolo read and which gets them to fall in love and causing eventually, since Paolo is, as some of you know, not her husband, but her brother-in-law, with whom she's having an adulterous relationship, and that kissing over the book ends up in a murder on the part of her husband, who dispatches the two of them. Now, Dante does put Francesca in hell and not in purgatory on the way to heaven, so we have to assume that he agreed with God's judgment, as it were, that she was indeed a sinner and that she's being punished for the sin of lust. That being true, can we see something behind her last line? And that day we read in it no further. Well, a Korean Dante scholar, Thomas Seung, many years ago in a book that he wrote called The Fragile Leaves of the Sibyl, pointed to a resonance in that line, which I think is right. And I've written on this as well. I'm seconding his original perception. And yet I think it's one that makes so much sense that I'm surprised that it waited so long to be discovered, if it is an accurate discovery. It's always chancy, this business, too. It's a very important line. It is perhaps the culminating moment of a work that we know Dante knew and loved and dealt with, the Confessions of St. Augustine. In the culminating moment of the Confessions, in Book 8, Chapter 12, Augustine reading St. Paul, Romans 13:14, when he is converted forever from lust and to charity. When he reads that crucial passage in Paul's text, he says, and I did not wish to read any further. In other words, I'm claiming, after T.K. Son, that when Francesca says, that day we read no further in that book, it's a parody of the moment of Augustinian conversion, that where Augustine says, I did not wish to read any further because I'd read enough and was converted finally. Here, Francesca is saying, and that day we did not read any further in the book because we made love, and even implying that on later days they read the book and made more love until they were dispatched. If that's true, if Dante meant us to see the citation of this crucial passage in St. Augustine at the end of Francesca's speech, then our way of responding to her, seems to me, is radically altered. At least it's altered if we're trying to read her romantically. We suddenly see a grid on which to place her. Here she is talking about love, talking about reading a romance, talking about not being guilty but being compelled by the force of love that called upon her to do things that now have resulted in her damnation. Yet we're reminded that there was free choice all the while. We're reminded that she did have options. We're reminded that she had her will, exactly what Augustine exercises finally, successfully in the 8th book of the Confessions, what he had been unable to exercise despite the excellence of his intellect. He finally gathers his will in that 8th book. She gathers her will in exactly the wrong direction. Now, as I say, if that is true, if we are meant to justify Francesca's behavior, we're not going to be able to do so if we can see that it's being parodied by the model that it doesn't follow. Here she is, what's she doing? Reading a book. That's what Augustine did. Augustine's reading a book by a man named Paul. She's kissing a man named Paul. The parallels, though they are historical, are nonetheless so great as to make coincidence seem to me at least a little bit unlikely. Thus, that sort of strategy, if it's what Dante employed, we have to say one thing about it. It was not very successful. It took a Korean graduate student who came out of the war between the two Koreas to Yale, studying for a doctoral degree in philosophy, and he was the first person who noticed this. Now, you know, if that was a strategy, it's not a very good strategy, or we're not very good readers, or both. And I think I would submit that the latter is probably the best construction to understand the situation. Dante's too good for us, but maybe a little bit too good for himself.